Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today I'm going to continue the series on learning about Hegel, half hour Hegel. Um, we last time we left on off on sections 59 through 60. So as usual, I'm going to read these introductions or these summaries that I made and Dr. Sadler made, and then we'll jump into it. So I said, in the last section, Hegel shows why argumentative thinking is insufficient to truly explore and build a solid or dynamic understanding. He uses terms like subject, predicate, and accident to show how argumentative thinking simply pits ideas against each other and uses external negation that deconstructs the subject. Thus, the subject is a sort of passive bystander. Alternatively, speculative or dialectical thinking uses the negative to create the positive and go back and forth in a self moving cycle of learning. He shows how the dialectics of speculative thinking treats the subject as the thing in and of itself and uses the predicates to further move the subject to give us a much deeper understanding. So, yeah, I think that, that goes into some things there. That is a nice little summary of the last section. Let's see what Dr. Sadler says. Now, granted, I don't know, the kind of background of subject and predicate and this kind of context. So I'm sure Dr. Sadler will have more insights there. So let's see. He says in these two paragraphs, Hegel is contrasting the speculative or dialectical approach with the argumentative or r- ratio ratiocinative approach. Both of them work with negativity, but the negativity of the argumentative mode of thought is merely negative and lapses into a stance of vanity or futility. The dialectical approach, working with the concept of notion, begriff, incorporates the negative within the content, making it also positive, and leads to the determinate negative or determinate negation. So actually, let me show y'all this stuff because a lot of big words. So you can just read along with me here. So that's what I was reading this first paragraph. So that's a word I have a problem with ratio-synative approach. Very interesting. So yeah, I like how he broke this down. He broke this down a lot better than I could. Hegel discusses how this works for both approaches in terms of traditional terms of logic and communication, subject, predicate, and accident, and speculative thinking. The subject is not passive, but enters into its own determinations, i.e., predicates and accidents, thereby becoming concrete, becoming a self-moving substance or essence or notion for the observing human subject. Nice, nice. Oops, wrong way, wrong way. So yeah, great as always summary of the last section. So go ahead and jump into the next one. Oops.
Formerly, what has been said can be expressed thus. The general state of the judgment or proposition which involves the distinction of subject and predicate is destroyed by the speculative proposition, and the proposition of identity which the former becomes contains the counterthrust against that subject-predicate relationship.
Hmm.
This conflict between the general form of a proposition and the unity of the notion which destroys it is similar to the conflict that occurs in rhythm between meter and accent. Rhythm results from the floating center and the unification of the two. So too in the philosophical proposition, the identification of subject and predicate is not meant to destroy the difference between them, which is the form of the proposition expresses. Their unity rather is meant to emerge as a harmony. The
Hmm.
form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense or the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment, but that the predicate expresses the substance and that the subject itself falls into the universal. This is the unity in which the accent dies away.
Hmm. A lot of beautiful. I like the music there. Comparing this argument or this way of thinking as a sort of music making pattern there. Uh, I'm gonna have him wait for him to go through it, but I don't know. Let's see what he says here because there was a lot of big stuff there.
In section 61, Hegel is continuing this discussion about subjects and predicates and about the forms of propositions or judgments. And why does he say proposition or judgment? Because these are two different acts or two different products of the reasoning, the thinking individual, or just the repeating individual as well, the mimic. And what's going on in these? When one makes a judgment, one predicates something of a subject. That's the grammatical form of it. And we're often tempted to think that the logical form, in the sense
Excuse
of
me.
what's really going on in the intelligibility of what's being talked about, is the same thing as the grammatical form. As a matter of fact, for some people, they're willing to collapse logic and grammar into each other. Hegel wants to resist that, not because he thinks that grammar is something special or even logic is something intrinsically special, but because that just doesn't fit the way that consciousness actually develops and the way that consciousness grasps things. That's what this section, whether you realize it or not, is really about. He's saying formally expressed, here's what we can say about this, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But what he's really getting at is why this subject-predicate understanding, where the subject is kind of just a hanger to put predicates on, why that can't capture what's going on in philosophy and in our relations with the world, our understanding of ourself, our situating ourselves in history. So that's a lot of, backstory, you might say, or revealing what's going on, but I think that's kind of helpful here. So he says, formally what's been said, the general nature of the judgment or proposition. So when we engage in a judgment, we are affirming that something is the case, or we are deciding that something is the case. We're saying that it appears that way to us. A proposition is expressing that something is the case. And you might say, what's the difference between those? One involves sort of an active stance upon whatever it is that we're discussing. The other can be much more passive. A proposition can be just kind of floating out there, and you say, well, yeah, I
Sorry, I'm doing all this yawning. Actually was reading up on that, and apparently, when you yawn, it's actually your brain kind of like I knew this before, like your brain is kind of refreshing and things like that. But it's actually what I recently learned is that yawning is good for memory retention as well. It's like when you're reading, for instance, and you yawn and stuff like that. Uh, your brain is trying to basically store it better. Essentially, I'm really simplifying this, but it's a good way for your brain to realize, okay, this is a lot of information. We need to make space for it. We need to incorporate it and things like that. So yawning is a good thing. I don't mean to like be like, oh yeah, it's tired, it's boring, whatever. No, it's just my brain trying to absorb this stuff. All right. I
think that's the way it
don't know if people were even thinking about that, anyways. Sorry for the interruption. Let's get it.
is. When you say that, you're making a judgment about your relation to the proposition. So, the general form of the general nature of the judgment or proposition involves a distinction between subject and predicate. I am a college professor. I am the subject. Predicate is a college professor, or just college professor, and we can say there's a copula there. The verb is, depending on how we want to parse this out. Now he says it's destroyed by the speculative proposition. So this seems to imply that there is something out there called the speculative proposition, the speculative Satz. Satz is proposition or sentence, and that's not actually going to be the case. We might say better the speculative handling of propositions, because as we're going to see a little bit later on, we can't completely get away from this. We can't get away from grammar. We can't get away from using words in ways that are familiar to us, even while we're doing speculative philosophy. So then he says it's destroyed by the speculative proposition and the proposition of identity, or the identity proposition. Identische Satz is how the German runs. Which the former contains the counter thrust against that subject-predicate relationship. So he's saying it doesn't completely destroy it, it doesn't do away with subject and predicate, but what it does is it gives us a richer relationship between them that we can actually understand, we can wrap our heads around.
Kind of
So
breaks
we've
the
seen this
simplistic
quite
view.
often in the previous proposition or the previous sections, right? He'll say the subject, which we take to be sort of an inert thing, we take it as that which we know best, and we just sort of predicate other things of it. Turns out that when we look at it closely, if the subject really is a subject, it's got agency, it is not passive, and the subject sort of ebbs or bleeds itself into the predicate,
Hmm.
and the predicate becomes a thing that we actually know the subject through. Later on, he's going to talk, and also in the logic, he's going to talk about essence and appearance. Essence shows itself by appearing, by having some sort of agency, by having some sort of activity. And in this, he says there's a difference between the subject and the predicate. And we've seen this, played out in many passages so far. Things self-other, and if they're self-moving objects or self-moving subjects, what they do is they become other to themselves, and then they reincorporate that otherness into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's this establishment of difference. And then there's, I almost put unity at first, but it really is unification of the subject and the predicate.
Hmm.
How do they become unified? By us knowing the subject through its predicate.
Mm.
By us realizing that the subject becomes other to itself through having the predicate, and then it gets reappropriated into that. So he says,
Mm.
how should we understand this? And this is where he's got a really interesting metaphor, a musical metaphor. Now, you have to understand a little bit about ancient...
Before we get into that, we're just gonna pause for a second because that whole grammar breakdown is a very interesting aspect to this. I don't know why, but like grammar, it's not like I've been bad at it, but it always seemed arbitrary in a way. Like I get it, why we have this grammar and stuff like that, but focusing too much on it has always seemed arbitrary to me. But as I've learned more and more about the importance of language in terms of how we think, I think it does make sense to kind of focus on it a little bit. And the fact that he was able to describe this, I guess dialectic approach through our grammar is very powerful there, right? Like this that he was talking about earlier about how Hegel was talking earlier about how when you discuss something, it becomes other than itself, like what Dr. Sally said here. And again, that idea seems so, I don't know what's the word for it, weird. Right, like, oh, you become other than yourself, but like it's like very trippy, right? Kind of typical philosophy mumbo jumbo, right? Like, what are you saying there? Saying like exactly what it is. Like when you create a sentence, like I am, a person, the subject I becomes other than itself by having this thing after it, by just not saying I am, or even I am can be its own subject predicate thing. But if you says I, right? Okay, like okay, I am a person, right? That predicate, I guess you can call it, is makes you think about what it means to be I and what it means to be person, and how the relation between you, like I, you, as in and that other, this concept of person and of personages or whatever you want to call it, like the concept of persons is different than you, but at the same time is related to you. I'm not sure if I'm breaking this down right, but I'm just trying to make sense of it in my head, and that our everyday language, right? That every sentence we make, every sentence we write and think about and talk about, right? We're doing these micro kind of philosophies, if you will, right? We're constantly, othering this concept of the subject, whatever subject we're talking about, whether it's yourself or other things or other people, whatever, right? We're constantly othering that, turning it into something else that we conclude the sentence with, or that we're continuing the sentence with. And then by doing so, it comes back into itself. So we gain a better understanding of what we're even saying. And we're doing this like quickly, right? Like milliseconds. Our brain is just constantly going through this cycle. And it's just so fascinating when you think about it like that, right? That's why it's not just mumbo jumbo crap. It's like when you actually take your time and think about like how language works, you're like, whoa, wow, this is trippy, right? And that is like insightful. That is like important to understand. And the reason why it's important is because, right, it allows you to understand why language breaks down and why, meanings break down, why communication breaks down. That if you have a certain definition of the subject and then you put a predicate that I'm not familiar with, but that makes sense to you, then we're going to have this clash of understanding and things like that. And this is how you can get into like manipulation, because when the other person knows that you have a certain idea of the world, and they're playing on that in order to reincorporate that subject, right, with the different predicate. By like, you hear this all the time with things like immigrants. Like, if you want to be very topical, what's going on with Ukraine right now, right? um the fact that people view these immigrants as like good immigrants, but the people who came from like Syria or something like that as like bad immigrants, right? Like the way in which people craft those sentences and those phrases, right, really gets you to think about these people as two different concepts, even though they're the same kind of general thing, right? um so the philosophy is very important, right? The way we think about these things and the way we craft our languages is very important. So yeah, I just found that very interesting with how he broke that down, and it was just connecting dots in my mind. So this is why I love this book so far. It's and Dr. Sadler, of course, for breaking it down. It's really fascinating.
Use of rhythm, meter, and stress in poetry for this to make sense to you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on that. Ancient Greek and Latin poetry does not concentrate on end rhyme like our poetry does,
Mm.
in English, I mean. And so what they
Extra
focus
space and
on
things, yeah.
is meter.
Right.
So, you could have a foot, as they call it, where it's long, short, short, or you could have, short, short, long. These are different kinds of feet: short, short, long, long. That's what we call meter. And what do they mean by long there? Well, the word would be stretched out, and that would be done because certain vowels had, long quantity,
Like
as
look
other vowels would be short.
versus Luke.
So, here's just a line from, I forget exactly who this is from, it might be an acronym. Halapos de me
Oh,
filestai,
excuse me.
halapos de te filestai, halapoteron de panton, hapantama non filestai. So that's a very short poetic piece. And
Hmm.
you notice that it has a rhythm to it. Da 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 da. So it's got a meter to it, and if we wanted to express that meter, it would be da 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 da, almost like Morse code, right?
Hmm.
Short, long. Morse code is kind of like that. Now we add to it the accent. Accent means stress.
Mm-hmm.
Da 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 da. We put that in there, and we could do this with this, da 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 da. If we're doing it like that, it's da 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 da. Well, we might change the accent up. Da 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 da,
Mm.
and that changes the way that it comes across. That's changing the rhythm. Now, we don't have this, like I said, very much in our current poetry. When it's done with some sort of verse, we tend to have fairly simple constructions. Iambic pentameter is a good example of that. Da 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 da. Is that right? It should be 5 feet pentameter,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just going like that. You can monkey around with it a bit when you actually know how to do it right, but that's the basic idea. Greek and Latin poetry used that as its basis.
Sorry, but this is why you have to listen to hip hop, right? Like, good hip hop gets into all this. Now, they might not break it down into the iambic pentameter and saying what the pentameters are, and like, or the meters, like describing this with vocabulary, unfortunately. And this is why we need more hip hop, you know, anal- analysis. Is people that I might have to do that one day, right? I might have. I'm gonna think on that, because like there's so many amazing hip hop songs. Some lyrical, some not. Some are just like trap song, like trap music, right? But trap music, for those that don't know, is like things like um you may have heard like somewhat mumble rap or like just there for the vibes, just like whatever, hard beat, not great lyrics, but it's mostly about like the sound, right? And a lot of hip hop, music plays around with these different meters, and that's what really fascinates me about hip hop music, is that even if a song doesn't have good lyrics, you can get with the vibe, right? Because of this, how they play around with the meter. Like they would, slow it down with the dun, dun, dun. Like I'm not a rapper, so but they have you have a famous triplet flow, right? Triplet, triplet, triplet. This is Migos made this super famous, but it was big before them. Like 3 6 Mafia, it was one of the first ones that really get into this. But this triplet flow is kind of tired nowadays. But even with Migos, right, they have certain songs that change the meter and the accents, right? So like I'm not a huge Migos fan myself, so I can't say a specific one, but like like Bad and Bougie is probably a popular one, right? Like then Bad and Bougie, right? Did it, did it, did it, did it, did it, did it, did. And if you listen to the song, granted the lyrics are problematic, but if you listen to the song and how they change the accents, you can actually see this happening in the middle of the song, right? It's so fascinating how people have been able to like kind of glean onto like these types of structures, right? And so what I would love to see is a analysis on songs that use this consciously, right? Like I understand that a lot of people use this unconsciously, but I do think like people like Kendrick, Cole, Eminem, you know um probably a bunch of other people, Jade, Denzel, like a lot of people probably use this more consciously to change, the meaning of a song based on how they accent certain words, right? And I'm pretty sure a lot of them do it very consciously. So I would love to see an analysis on that because unfortunately, it is right. Like typical, English literature and poetry doesn't really get into that anymore because it's too focused on the rhyming at the end. And but hip hop has evolved so far that some of them, like Eminem, people love to hate on Eminem nowadays. He's just not as good, doesn't fight. But if you listen to the like how he rhymes his words, he's more concerned about like internal rhyme and meter, how stressing a certain syllable changes the definition of that word with the English language, right? The English language is not really known for um its tonalities based on like other compared to other languages, but artists like Eminem can show you that how changing, the accent of a word can really completely change, how you think about it, and how you hear it. So yeah, it's I really love this idea here because you see this so much in hip hop, and I would love to see it more in other forms of literature and media and stuff like that. It's really fascinating.
For rhythm. German poetry, and we're talking about like, really old German poetry, things like the Nibelungenlied, didn't worry so much about meter, but they did worry about accent, and they used a thing called Stabreim, which means stress rhyme. Now, we have something like this. It's used in lyricism in songs, and it's used particularly in spoken word music, like rap or hip hop, where the rhythm really matters, and the rhythm is consisting of meter and accent. So all of that's fine. Now we've got that down. Why does Hegel bring that up, and why did I bother to explain that? Notice that it doesn't have this sort of connection. It's not like there's a subject and then we just predicate things of it, sort of like putting, first we have Greg Sadler, the body, and then we put on a shirt, and then we put on a tie, and then we put on a jacket covering it. Instead, these things interpenetrate each other. That's the really key thing here. Rhythm is a kind of harmony, a coming together harmoniously, sympathetically, interpenetrating each other, of meter and accent. Similarly, Hegel is saying that conceptually what's going on in the notion is the subject and the predicate are interpenetrating each other. How are they doing that? Through us. We're able to understand them like that. So he says the form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense or the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment. But that the predicate expresses the substance, and that the subject itself falls into the universal. This is the unity in which the accent dies away. So what we're looking at here is really the death of the subject, if we want to be very dramatic about that. And he's got much more to say about that, but we'll look at that in future sections.
Love it, love it. Let's get into it some more.
To illustrate what has been said, in the proposition God is being, the predicate is being. It has the significance of something substantial in which the subject is dissolved. Being is here meant to be not a predicate, but rather the essence. It seems consequently that God ceases to be what he is from his position in the proposition, that is, a fixed subject. Here, thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject, and missing it is thrown back on the thought of the subject. Or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as the subject, as the being, or essence, which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate, and now, having returned into itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it is still absorbed in the content, or at least is faced with the demand that it should be. Similarly, too, when one says the actual is the universal, the actual as subject disappears in its predicate. The universal is not meant to have entirely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the essence of the actual.
So let me back up a little bit to this last section here. You're thinking instead of making progress and stretching from the subject to predicate, and reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject, and missing it is thrown back into the thought of the subject. So that like process of like talking about something, of creating, of describing that thing, right? Loses the original thing. Like again, that I am a person, and saying that sentence and thinking about that sentence, you kind of lose a sense of I, the sense of what you are in terms of what this person is, and then gets thrown back like that person. Once you have an understanding of that, gets thrown back into the I, right? Again, I know I'm probably simplifying this, but I just find it so interesting. Since predicate says as a being in essence which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate, and now having returned into the predicate instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it is still absorbed in the content, or at least it's faced with the demand that it should be. Very, very interesting stuff right here. So it's really, I mean, we've been talking about the same kind of idea here, kind of. So I think it's a little obvious what we're getting at, but it is interesting how often or different ways in which he's describing the same kind of concept of divorcing from a thing, going back into itself, um, and as that thing is being othered, right, it becomes something else. Like the original kind of idea of it gets kind of blown into smithereens, and you look into this new thing, kind of like cloning, right, or teleporting rather, I should say. Like when you teleport, or our current ideas of teleportation is that when you um, only way we might be able to teleport is if you destroy the original self and then recreate the different you with all the same atoms kind of moving in the same velocities and stuff like that. So you're recreated somewhere else, but technically that means you have a discontinuity of the self. um I know that was a bit of a tangent there, but just different ways of saying the same thing, I suppose.
Thinking therefore loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject when in the predicate it is thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate it does not return into itself, but into the subject of the content. In section 62, Hegel is giving us a very helpful illustration, actually two illustrations of what he's just been trying to get across to us in the last several paragraphs. And again, we're dealing with subject and predicate relations. And so he wants to say, consider this example. God is being. So why would somebody say that? Well, it's really a commonplace if you are a traditional theist of a certain sort. Um, this is actually where a lot of people who are not theists or who are not traditional theists actually misunderstand some of the ontological claims lying behind traditional theism, traditional Christian, traditional Jewish, traditional Muslim
Mm.
ideas of things. God doesn't have being for somebody like St. Anselm. God is being. Being, in a certain sense, is not exactly what it is for things like me or the chalk. Only the absolute being truly is being as such. So if we want to
This is a really interesting concept too. This is something I've been exploring, not necessarily recently, but in the last couple of years. So I was raised, Seventh Day Adventist, and fortunately, they never really get into this amount of theory, which they probably should have. I personally would have been interested in it more. But I read like a lot of the Bible growing up, and I always used to think about like, how does this work, and is there all this other stuff, and you constantly hear this idea of like, oh, from in terms of like scientists, like atheist versus theist, you have this idea of, oh, God exists and prove it, right? But the whole thing there is that you don't prove that God exists because, um well, I have my own theories now, but back then it's like you don't prove that God exists because that's the whole point of faith, right? Is that you don't have to prove it. You just have faith, and then boom, boom, boom. All right, and that's the part that always dissatisfied me about religion and things like that. But as I've gotten more into reading like the original kind of texts, um, like I started reading, I forgot what it's called, but like some of the ancient Indian, Vedics, I think, or something like that. Now, granted, of course, not in the original Sanskrit, but like whatever it was called. But like some of the things that was inspiration to a lot of Christianity, right? Because it predates it by a couple thousand years, which people don't understand. But a lot of like the ancient Indian stuff and even ancient African stuff, unfortunately, there's not as much or literature of the ancient African stuff because they depended more on oral history, and which is just now finding some sort of respect. But anyways, a lot of the ancient kind of things around religion and spirituality, went into this idea here, right? That this idea of God, this idea of a higher being, right, is in itself being. And so you don't have to even have faith that they exist because we exist, right? And I found that really interesting because when we're talking about theism and stuff like that, or any sort of religion, it gets real too messy. It gets really abusive in a way because you're saying, oh, if you don't believe, then you don't have faith, and therefore you can't be here, right? It's used as a term of as a means of exclusion. But from a philosophical standpoint, right, the idea of a god or a higher power is very beautiful in a way. Like I get it, I get why people believe in this stuff. And it's beautiful when it's seen in this way, right? When it's seen in this idea of like this higher power being life itself, being existence in itself. And so you don't have to prove that exists because we exist, right? So therefore, trying to ask whether or not God exists is like asking whether or not you exist. And so that's why you can get into this, solipsistic way or this other stuff, I guess, into what does it mean for me to exist? What does it mean for consciousness to exist, right? And it's in those ways, and those kind of conversations, religion or spirituality, whatever you want to call it, is what much more interesting to me and much more insightful in a way. It gets deeper into this thing, this existence of life and consciousness and things like that. So yeah, I like this thing here, and I didn't catch it the first time. So thank you again, Dr.
know
Sandberg.
the nature of being, then we have to somehow penetrate into the mystery of knowing what God is, right? Now, you don't have to necessarily accept that in order to understand what we're saying here and what we're getting at. So Hegel is picking up on something that, say, Thomas Aquinas could have put forward, or Rene Descartes could have put forward. Um, and he's saying, let's consider this now. In this proposition, God is being, what is going on? We have God as the subject, grammatically. God is, we're saying something about God. We're predicating something about God. And what are we doing? We're saying God is being. We could also say God is merciful, or God is loving, or God is angry today, or God is, 23 and a half centimeters tall. We could come up with all sorts of predicates, but we're picking is being at this time. So he says,
Gonna go a quick little tangent here too, but actually now this is making me think more back on when they do, because they do say, "Oh, God is merciful, God is loving," this and things that. Um, and I think the problem with that in terms of modern day religions is they don't have a philosophical standpoint behind that. So when they say God is merciful, what they're a lot of people are thinking is that this big man in the sky has mercy, right? But from this context, from a philosophical context, I think it'll be more interesting, right? If people realize that what people are saying or what the texts are saying, what the kind of original philosophy is saying is that God is mercy, right? Like the idea of mercy is God, right? The idea of anger is God. The idea of this, and so, and I mean, you can't say, "Oh, then it's meaningless," right? And what's the point? But this is when you get into the concept of what we mean by God and what we mean by consciousness and this, that, and the other. And I think that's just a more interesting conversation to have, in terms of spirituality and things like that. But unfortunately, a lot of religions don't go into that depth. They just say God is merciful, right? Keep it moving. And therefore you should be this, that, and the other. And I think that is the problem of, once again, people not respecting philosophy, of people thinking philosophy is just just talking about words or whatever, right? It fundamentally gets you thinking about the world differently. And because it gets you thinking differently, you act differently, right? So if you don't have a respect or knowledge or a curiosity even about philosophy, then in many ways then you won't have a respect or curiosity for thinking in and of itself, for critical thought, for for knowledge. In a way, you kind of just accept things at face value, which is very problematic as we see today. So yeah, just came to mind.
um, being as the predicate has the significance of something substantial in which the subject is dissolved. So I'm going to put a number of things up here, just adding to our understanding of what Hegel's saying. So being here is something that is substantial. It's saying God is a kind of thing, God is a kind of substance, whatever being happens to be in the fullest sense. And from the vantage point of the thinking subject, now, we've seen this before, the subject is passing.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to speed it up because now my mind is just going, and I keep having all these thoughts. And again, sometimes I just need to speed up so my brain just focuses on this.
Over into its predicate. If we want to know what the subject is, we can't just assume it as a fixed starting point. There's ways of doing philosophy where that's precisely what you do. You begin with these fixed axioms and then, move out from there. Hegel's saying, no, if we actually want to learn anything about anything, that's not the way we actually do it. We begin with something that we think that we know, then we predicate something, and it turns out that the predicate is a hell of a lot more intelligible than what we began with. And now we say, now I get it. What this is this actually thing, this over here. Now I'm starting to understand.
Right.
So, being is something substantial in that case, and the subject is being dissolved. He says being is here not meant to be a predicate, that's why I have this predicate, but rather the essence, the Wesen in German, the very being of the being in a certain sense. And what's the significance of this? To say that it's not just a predicate, but the essence. It's saying that we're getting at the heart of the thing. If we want to say something like, imagine we're trying to talk about a person, and you say, I want to hire this guy, what can you tell me about him? He starts out with sort of an X, and maybe he's got, certain attributes. He walks into the office, he's dressed in a coat and tie, and you say, is this guy a schmuck? Is he, somebody who's high caliber? Is he a thief? Is he a stand-up guy? Now you're asking me for predicates. And if you want to get to the very heart of the matter, you're actually looking for something like an essence. You're actually looking for me to tell you, who is this person at heart? Who is this person at his core? And so let's say that I actually have known this person my entire life, and I say, this is somebody who you don't want to trust. I could tell you all sorts of stories about him, but I'm going to crystallize those in one thing that I'm going to say. He is totally disreputable. Now I'm saying something about that person's essence. Could be false, could be true. Don't worry about that at this point. The main thing is to see what Hegel's actually talking about here.
Right.
He's talking about essence. Talking about something that's the heart of the matter. And now all the other stuff about that guy just kind of dissolves into this thing that I've predicated of him, or the essence which I've revealed. That becomes his substantiality. And another way of thinking about this is the subject has been lost. The thinking subject, which is us, we're watching the subject being lost. Why? Well, because what's happened over here is we actually have
A new subject.
the predicate
Mm.
as a new kind of subject.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that we can say something more about, right? So he says the thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject. Missing it is thrown back onto the thought of the subject. Or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as subject, as the being, the essence, which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate. So what is the subject
That's
here?
how you make
It's
that
really
movement forward,
this
right?
here, and now we found it within the predicate.
Mm-hmm.
Who was this guy that you were thinking of interviewing, that you have sitting in your office, biding his time while you come out and talk with me? Turns out that it's this over here. That's the same thing, and it's caught up within the side of the predicate. So he says, now having returned to itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it's still absorbed in the content. It becomes absorbed in this side, or at least is faced with the demand that it should be. Now Hegel's going to give us another example. So instead of God as being, and we start to look at, well, what is being? And then once we start to explore it a bit, we find out that God is there inside of being, and it gets very complicated. Let's look instead at some other possibility. The actual, there's our subject, is the universal. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, in this case, he says, the universal is not meant to have merely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the, once again, essence of the subject. What it is to be actual is to be universal. Now we could tell a story. He's going to tell all sorts of stories about how this works. Let me just give you the quickest of thumbnail sketches about that. Part of what's going on with Hegel when he says that the actual is universal means that when something actually exists and has agency, when it matters, it assumes a kind of universalizing status. You might think of it as able to spread itself out into multiple contexts. We use this word transfer in education to talk from going from area to area to area. And we can think about that as also applying to human beings. So if it works for me, then if it's actual for me, then it's potentially actual for you. You can relate to it. It's attaining a kind of universality. If you become attracted into that, I might be the trendsetter who starts something actual, and now you're doing it. I mean, think about, for example, this as I forget which cultural critic called it, but part of the costume of the bourgeois man, the tie, right? At one point, this was, an innovation. Somebody started out with this, and eventually it caught on, and it attained a kind of universality. You have to wear a tie in a business setting or a professorial academic setting. No, as a matter of fact, you might actually, by using the tie, negatively produce the absence of the tie. You show a kind of informality or transcending the tie, but you're still using it as a universal in that case. Do you see how that works? So anyway, back to this.
I love that.
The same sort of dynamic is going on. The subject gets lost within the predicate and then gets found within the predicate again. We conceptualize, we come to understand, we attain the intelligibility of what it is to be actual by looking at this process of becoming universal. So he says, thinking therefore loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject that it began with when in the predicate. It's thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate, it does not return into itself, but into the subject of the content. So we've got this back and forth dialectic going on.
Yeah.
And this is not something that attains a completely fixed, satisfying position at this point. We're going to have to go on further with respect to that. This is part of why the dialectic is dynamic. Negativity is pulling it through, you can say. And the negativity is partly on the part of the thinking subject.
Oh, love this stuff, man. This
This
is great.
abnormal inhibition of thought is in large measure the source of the complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. Here we see the reason...
He throwing shots again. He throwing shots. He said this abnormal inhibition of thought is in large measure the source of the complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. Right. So he's like, you have this ability to understand it and to talk about it, but you don't, right? Because you only go on the surface level. So I guess this is what Hegel. I'm sorry, Dr. Sattler was saying in the earlier. I was reading. Oh, actually, I didn't read it. Sorry, I was reading his comments, and somebody was talking about how in the last video, someone was talking about, oh, is he redefining the predicate, subject, this, that, and the other? And Dr. Sally responded in the comments like, you'll find out more as you read on. But essentially, he's saying he's not necessarily trying to he is redefining it, but what he's actually saying is that these other people who had it before didn't go deep enough, right? So he's not like he's trying to redefine it. He's just trying to go deep into I think a truth or whatever that they uncovered, but didn't show enough of, didn't go deeper enough. So I think that's what he's saying here, right? Like they have this ability to talk about this stuff, but they don't go deep enough into it. They don't dive into it enough.
writings from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. Here we...
This Quasines, yeah, they, I don't know, be commenting. So thank you for coming by. I see 100 here. Thank you for coming by.
See the reason behind one particular complaint so often made against them. That so much has to be read over and over before it can be understood. A complaint whose burden is presumed to be quite outrageous and, if justified, to admit of no defense. It is clear from the above what this amounts to. The philosophical proposition, since it is a proposition, leads one to believe that the usual subject-predicate relation obtains, as well as the usual attitude towards knowing. But the philosophical content destroys this attitude and this opinion. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean, and this correction of our meaning compels our knowing to go back to the proposition and understand it in some other way.
Mm. Looking forward to this
So
breakdown.
section 63 is dealing with something that is really close to my own experience and my heart, and it's actually kind of funny to think about, and probably something that a lot of people out there can relate to as well on both sides, the claiming things are unintelligible side and the being surprised by the fact that other people find it unintelligible and dismiss it for that reason. So Hegel's looking at this common complaint about philosophical writings, philosophical works, and I think this is just as true today as it was back in his time. It's probably always going to be true. He's probably got his finger on something very important there. As a matter of fact, as a corollary, if he's actually right about this, then it's probably the case that anything that is easily grasped and understood as such is probably, if not already, at least on the verge of becoming crap philosophy, which is to say not philosophy at all, but just sort of mumbling along, using some words, doing groupthink. You know, we could come up with all sorts of other ways of expressing this. So he says, this abnormal inhibition of thought, what does he mean there? Going back to the previous two sections, the thinking subject trying to make sense out of philosophical propositions, which do have this subject-predicate form, and going back and forth, finding that the subject it loses itself in the predicate, but the predicate doesn't seem to get reabsorbed back into the subject, but we find the subject within it, and so there's a kind of circularity there that tends to discomfort people. It tends to produce cognitive dissonance, particularly since we always tend to think that if there's some circularity there, that it's vicious circularity. Hegel's saying it's not. So he says it's the source of the
Before he
complaint
goes on, I just another tangent. Sorry, but this reminds me of those people who, not just those people, but like a lot of people, right? Who find it like when he said cognitive dissonance, like people who don't want to accept the truth because of what it might mean, right? They're like, oh, let's take a really hot topic, the bipartisanship in America, when they say, oh, left wing, right wing, right? Oh, Democrats can't be right because if they are, then that means I'm a bad person or this, that, and the other, right? So SGWs, can't be saying anything smart or useful because that means I'm an asshole and I'm this, that, and the other. I can't, there's no way, right? So we have this circular thought, right? We have this circular reasoning. That's not exactly circles, more sphere, more spiral, spiral. It's more of a spiral, right? You're going inwards or outwards or the thing. But basically, right? We have this idea. We realize what it might mean for us, right? As that definition becomes clarified, as it gains context, and as it gets into the essence of that thing, and then this is where you have to have a choice if you're going to accept that, right, and take it in and like integrate it into your knowledge base, or if you're going to dismiss it. You're going to say, oh, no, that means the whole thing is wrong. Right, this is a serious problem with a lot of our politics today, a lot of our communications today, I should say, right, because people kind of dismiss politics itself, as a excuse me, as a thing of just unintelligible stuff and just hot topic stuff, when in reality politics is just communicating about decisions that we want to make as a people, right? So any communication is open to this kind of problem of people thinking, of people following the kind of cycle, of saying, okay, this subject, you're saying this predicate, so that means the subject will be this. Oh, and then it comes back and you're like, oh, are you going to accept it or not, right? So I just found that really interesting. I wanted to touch on that. So yeah, sorry.
Regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings, and here's where he says something really interesting, from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. So he's not worried about people who, because either they rejected the opportunities given them, or they were never given the opportunities, or they simply aren't up to it with their mental capacities, the people who haven't had a good education. He's saying that even among the people who've had a good education, quite a few of them can't understand philosophy. This is true today. Why is it true? Well, because when you're really doing philosophy, you're engaging in a highly abstract, reflexive thinking process that there aren't hard and fast rules for, and requires you to do quite a bit of personal development in order to be able to make it work. Like I say to my students quite often, if you're reading the text, and it's a classic text, and you're not getting anything out of it, there's no problem with the text, there's a problem with you. And what you need to do is figure out how not to adapt the text to you via SparkNotes or Wikipedia articles or things like that. You need to figure out how to adapt your brain, your mind, your intellect to that text, because there's something out there that provides the standard for you. And usually what I'll do is I'll say, look at these other students. They're not any smarter or dumber than you, and yet they're able to understand what Plato's talking about, because here's their paper. So when you say, I just don't get it, or it's unintelligible, that's actually a mark against you, not a mark against the material. So he says, here we see that one of the reasons. So much has to be read over and over before it can be understood. A complaint whose burden is presumed to be quite outrageous. If it's not clear the first time around, then there's something wrong with it. I see this in comments on my videos quite frequently. There's two ways in which people frequently go wrong that I think Hegel could relate to. One is that, I'll say in the description to the video, we're covering this idea or this section, and they'll ask me about all sorts of stuff way over here, We're talking about something in Plato, and we're not talking about the theory of the forms, and then they want to ask me about the theory of the forms, or suggest that that's important here, or, they don't want to actually hunker down and just fix their attention on this and see where this actually goes. And that's one problem. Same thing comes up sometimes in these half-hour Hegel videos and some of the comments on them. The other thing is, it does take, going over this material several times in many cases, and actually going to the text to make sense of it. So, another kind of comment that I get is people will ask me questions or raise objections or get into arguments based on what I'm saying in the video, and they're not reading the actual text that the video is just merely at best a reflection of. Same thing with this. If you're watching this and you're hoping that I'm going to communicate Hegel to you and you're not going to have to read it, there's something wrong here. You actually do have to do the work, the intellectual labor. Like Hegel said, right? The patience, the labor of the negative, you have to put that work in order to reap the benefits. And sometimes benefits are intellectual. So he's saying that a lot of people in my day who, they didn't have SparkNotes, what they would do is read book reviews. What did Kant have to say about this? I'm not going to read the Kant. I'll just read, so-and-so's book review, but that'll be good enough for me. How do you know? It's sort of like the same problem with knowing what's a good translation or a bad translation if you don't read the original. How do you know if the translation of Hegel is good? How do you know if the translation of Plato is good? If you don't read Greek or you don't read German, and you don't actually, it's one thing to be able to read Greek or German, it's another to actually go to the text and say, I don't understand why he translated it this way. So these are all sort of good considerations to bring to the table. This common complaint.
Now, granted, there's, of course, some nuance here. I find it really difficult to learn new languages. I'm still trying to learn my mother tongue, Creole and French. So, going off to go learn German so I can read a text, it's out of the picture. But, sometimes, there are some nuances. We have to trust people like Dr. Sadler here. Okay, I trust that he's done his work and being able to translate these different things and figure out all this to figure out which one's a good translation, in that way. But even me, I'm still, even though I'm watching this through a video, I don't have the book in front of me, but I try to understand what Hegel's saying even before I get to, um, Dr. Sadler's explanations. And I do that because, like what he said, in the beginning, he said this is about the struggle. This is about the, grasping and things like that. So I try to, bring that into these videos as well. Um, I'm not sure if it's enough. Maybe after I'm done with this entire series in 10 years, I'll go back and read the text again and see if I can understand it. But I don't know. We shall see. Crazy said, still learning French after 40 years. Wow, fantastic. Yeah, that's probably going to be me right there. I'm probably going to be right behind you with that. So, language is just so fascinating. I'm still learning English, right? I'm still learning, words that I didn't realize and different ways of phrasing things and all that other stuff. Learning languages is a lifelong thing. One day I do want to get good at being able to learn many different languages, to a point where you can, communicate with those languages. But yeah, I like that call out too, right? Learning is a lifelong thing. So thanks as always for commenting and thanks for coming live today.
Philosophical writings are unintelligible. Here's a bunch of questions that we ought to be asking that person. When somebody says that they're unintelligible, do they just mean they're unintelligible to me, and that's a mark against me? Because maybe they are intelligible. A lot of other people say that they are. I just can't seem to get it. That's not usually what the person is saying, though, is it? Usually they're saying, well, because it's unintelligible to me, it's unintelligible to everyone.
Right.
Or it's unintelligible in itself. Because I can't understand Kant. Kant doesn't make any sense to anybody. He can't possibly be right. That's the sign of somebody who is, in a certain respect, well-educated, but in a certain respect, an ignoramus. To assume that simply because one is not in a position to understand something, that it is therefore completely unintelligible to everybody, when the evidence is other people saying, no, this actually can be understood, it's really a kind of strange defense mechanism or narcissism that people do. But Hegel's saying, look, people do this quite often. So he says, it's clear from the above what this amounts to. Why does this happen? Well, there's a reason for this. The philosophical proposition is, in fact, a proposition. It does, in fact, have this subject-predicate form. So that seduces us into thinking when we say something like, God is being. Let's say we take Anselm's prosologium, right? God is not only being, God cannot, by the time we get to chapter 4, God cannot even be coherently thought not to exist. He must, of necessity, exist. And yet God is, if you read further in, besides the so-called ontological proof, God is greater than what we understand as necessity. Well, that's kind of mind-blowing stuff. And if you think that the first time you read through it, you're going to get it just like that, you really have another thing coming. Concepts, if they're important concepts, if they're actual, robust concepts, they take us a while to come to terms with. I've been reading Anselm's Prosologion for close to 20 years now, and I still go back and forth as I read it about, does this make sense, or doesn't this make sense? And I've had a few experiences where you sort of break through to the other side, and now you see things in very different ways as a result. But that's because he's working with philosophical propositions. Hegel is too. Hegel is going to actually consider Anselm, not in this, but in his lectures on the philosophy of religion and the so-called ontological proof. So he's saying the philosophical content destroys the attitude and opinion of the normal way of dealing with subject-predicate. This is something that we've seen so far. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean. This is kind of a funny thing. We learn from experience. What experience? The experience of thinking. Also the experience of reading somebody else. Also the experience of trying to communicate those insights with other people. Also the experience of trying to take this batch of ideas and apply them to the world and to our own experience. We have experience about experience. We have experience about trying to conceptualize, trying to make sense out of in a dynamic, adequate way, our experience. So we have an experience, he says, that we meant something other than what we meant to mean. You might say this is totally incoherent. No, we have this sort of experience all the time. We are fallible creatures. We start out thinking one thing, and we come out the other end of the tunnel thinking something different. And what took place in the middle? We thought more about it. We realized that we were...
I know he's about to end here, but I just love this concept so much because this is what I do all the time, right? Like I have an idea or a concept or I'm learning something, and then I go off and try to think about it, and then I go and make a podcast. I go outside and just start talking, and I often find that my first kind of thoughts about it were not as clear as I thought they were in my head, and then so what I thought I meant may have been wrong or it may have been right, but in a different way. Right. So as I'm talking about a thing, even as I'm talking right now, I had a vague concept of what I meant or what I thought I meant or what I thought I was going to say. And then as I'm talking, it's just coming out differently. And I'm finding some of it, confirms what I was saying, but some of it kind of goes down a different way and allows me to kind of say it in a better way than I thought I was. I don't know if that's making sense, but I think it is in a way because it's a lot of our thinking is it's so amorphous, so organic, so just dynamic, right? To use these terms here, I guess that it's a term we use everywhere, but I think just this dynamism, this being dynamic is such a important part of being able to think of going through the thinking process. um and unfortunately a lot of our society makes it difficult to embrace that dynamism, to embrace that dynamic thinking because there's so much of bipolarism, or not bipolar, that's not a good there's so many bipartisanship, like just bifurcation, what's the term I'm looking for here? Binary, goodness, binary thinking, but all those other terms work too. But binary thinking in that you have to be this or that, right? And you have to know it or you don't know it. But in reality, a lot of our ideas and a lot of our concepts, we kind of know it. And the more we think about it, the more we know it, but the more we don't know it, and the more we know that we don't know. And so it's very nuanced, it's very spectrum based, it's very organic. I don't know. There's probably better words for it, but it's this point right here just so important in our ability to communicate and understand things and experience things. So oh man, this is fantastic.
We're actually wrong about things. When we got the subject predicate over here, we think that we know what a subject is, we predicate some things of it, we think about what that predicate means, the predicate reveals the essence, and now we see the subject in a whole different way.
Exactly.
There's nothing mysterious about this. There is something laborious about this. And because it's laborious, a lot of people are unwilling to put in the time. But if you don't put in the time, you won't receive the benefit, which is making sense out of what it is, not just that Hegel has here in this book, but the vistas that Hegel is opening up to us.
Mm. Mm. Beautiful. Another really fantastic video here. Absolutely love this. Thanks as always for watching. Let me know what you thought, what you learned through this section. Um, if you agree or disagree, whatever, right? I always like to have this conversation about this stuff. This is so freaking fascinating. I'm probably gonna, go ahead and write up this summary, then go out and do a podcast about half of the stuff I learned today. So, if you want to check out my podcast, check in the description. I put my links to everything. It's called Thoughts of a Techno Wizard, my kind of audio journal. So go check that out if you want. Um, but yeah, like this is fantastic stuff, and a lot of our thinking is so beautiful, right? A lot of this kind of dynamic, using this term again, thinking is just so beautiful because it allows us to, you know, um, grasp the world and experience things in a different way. We can experience things in our own minds, right? And I find that so crazy, right? Like you can experience just drinking water, just the general sensations, but you can also think about drinking water as you're drinking it. And then you can think about the fact that you're thinking about this thing and so on and so forth until you get like a little tripped out. But by doing so, right, you can kind of experience more of drinking the water, like this, right? Like the feeling of it going down your throat and what it's doing in your body and the weight of the cup and what it means to have water and the society in general. Like we can go as small as you want or as big as you want with these thoughts, and that experience, is in and of itself a kind of process of understanding the world, right? Of gaining an understanding of yourself and the world and your place in it and all this other stuff. And it's just so fascinating that we can do all these things. And by doing so, right, it takes a lot of work, but it also allows you to be able to communicate more and be able to have more ideas about, oh, what if we can, find a different way to drink water? What if we can, you know, um, I don't know, clean water more for other people who can't who don't have this, right? Who can't easily drink water. Like I don't know. But the point is that there's, even though it's immaterial in some ways, this ability to think and experience our thinking, it's also still very material, still very solid. It can still have a very real world impact. And yeah, I just hope, more people have this experience and respect and realize the impact and the power of that experience. But yeah, as always, thanks again, and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.